While the world was fixated on conflicts in Europe and the Middle East, a profound geopolitical shift was quietly unfolding. Africa, long perceived as a continent of dependency, began to strategically redefine its global position. This is the untold story of how African nations, with calculated precision, began to dismantle centuries of external control right under the radar. This is the narrative of how Africa outsmarted the West, and nobody noticed. For decades, the prevailing narrative cast Africa as a recipient of aid, a battleground for proxy wars, or a resource extraction zone. Former colonial powers transitioned into donors, their financial assistance often accompanied by conditionalities that perpetuated economic and political subservience. Loans replaced overt chains, and peacekeeping missions frequently served to maintain a status quo favorable to external interests rather than fostering genuine, unencumbered independence. Yet beneath this veneer of dependency, a new generation of African leaders and thinkers was observing, learning, and strategizing. They recognized the subtle mechanisms of neo-colonialism and the inherent vulnerabilities of a unipolar world order. In the last 3 years, this simmering discontent erupted into a series of decisive actions. A wave of military coups, notably in the Sahel region, signaled a radical departure from previous patterns. These were not merely internal power struggles, they were strategic recalibrations, often led by African soldiers trained in Western academies, now explicitly rejecting Western influence and demanding true sovereignty. These movements, exemplified by figures like Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso, were not impulsive acts. They represented a calculated rejection of the established order, a clear signal that the era of passive compliance was over. The sight of French soldiers departing Niger or African leaders asserting their presence at BRICS summits underscored a fundamental shift in power dynamics. Africa was no longer content to be a pawn, it was asserting its agency on the global chessboard. The speed and coordination of Africa's strategic pivot caught many Western capitals off guard. In a remarkably short period, key nations initiated bold moves to reclaim their autonomy. Mali, for instance, decisively moved to expel the French military presence, ending decades of security cooperation that many Malians viewed as ineffective and intrusive. This was followed by Burkina Faso's expulsion of various United Nations agencies and non-governmental organizations, signaling a desire to manage its own internal affairs without external interference. Perhaps most significantly, Niger, a critical partner in the U.S. counterterrorism strategy, issued demands for the closure of American drone bases. These actions were not random acts of defiance. They were deliberate, synchronized steps towards asserting national sovereignty and reducing reliance on former colonial powers for security and governance. The implications for regional stability and global power projection were immense. The US, France, and even the UN found themselves in an unprecedented position of shock and disbelief. Their surprise stemmed not just from losing control, but from their failure to anticipate such a coordinated and resolute rejection. This was not a chaotic descent into instability. It was a strategic reorientation. As Traoré famously articulated, "We are not anti-France. We are pro-Burkina Faso." This statement encapsulated the core of the new African strategy, a focus on national interest and self-determination rather than ideological alignment. This was a masterclass in strategic disengagement, executed with precision and a clear vision for a self-reliant future. As Western powers struggled to comprehend and respond to Africa's assertive moves, the continent was already forging new, diversified alliances. Africa did not isolate itself. Instead, it strategically opened new doors, embracing a multi-vector foreign policy that maximized its options and minimized external leverage. This pragmatic approach saw African nations engaging with a broader spectrum of global partners, each offering distinct advantages. Russia, for example, stepped in to offer military training and equipment, often with fewer political conditionalities than traditional Western partners. China continued its extensive infrastructure development projects and expanded trade relationships, providing an alternative to Western financial institutions. India offered expertise in education, technology, and defense training, fostering South-South cooperation. Crucially, the BRICS bloc, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, emerged as a pivotal platform. It welcomed African nations into the global South's inner circle, offering a vision of a multipolar world order based on mutual respect and shared development goals. The contrast was stark. Where the West often offered control disguised as aid, BRICS offered respect and partnership. Africa, having experienced centuries of conditional engagement, made a clear choice. The continent's growing presence at BRICS Africa summits, the African Union's inclusion in the G20, and the visible presence of Russian helicopters in Mali or Chinese-built infrastructure in Kenya all underscored this profound geopolitical repositioning. This was not merely smart diplomacy, it was a sophisticated masterclass in global repositioning, leveraging emerging power centers to secure greater autonomy and influence. For decades, institutions like the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank played a significant role in maintaining a cycle of debt dependency in Africa. Aid packages and loans often came with stringent conditionalities dictating economic policies, structural adjustments, and even political reforms. These measures, while ostensibly aimed at fostering development, frequently led to austerity, privatization, and a loss of economic sovereignty, effectively keeping African nations tethered to Western financial systems. However, Africa's strategic awakening extended to its economic policies. Nations began to challenge the very rules of the game, rules they had no hand in writing. Ghana, for instance, began to push back against certain IMF conditions, seeking more equitable terms that prioritize national development over external dictates. Zambia, facing significant debt, engaged in complex renegotiations with its Chinese creditors, asserting its terms rather than passively accepting them. Burkina Faso, under its new leadership, began exploring alternative economic models, including investing in its gold reserves and reducing reliance on the US dollar for international transactions. These actions represent a sophisticated counterstrike against the weaponization of debt. African nations are increasingly recognizing that true sovereignty requires economic independence. They are diversifying their financial partnerships, exploring local currency trade, and demanding more equitable terms from international lenders. The West continues to employ its traditional financial tools, but Africa has upgraded its economic software, developing resilience and alternative pathways to prosperity. This shift is not just about financial solvency, it's about reclaiming economic destiny. Beyond military and economic maneuvers, Africa waged and won a crucial battle in the information space. Western media outlets, often reflecting established geopolitical narratives, attempted to frame figures like Ibrahim Traoré and other new leaders as junta thugs or illegitimate rulers. This narrative aimed to delegitimize their actions and maintain the perception of African instability requiring Western intervention. However, this time the narrative control was challenged. Africans themselves, particularly the youth, rejected these portrayals. They saw these leaders not as despots, but as heroes who dared to stand up against perceived neo-colonialism and corruption. This divergence in perception highlighted a critical shift in information dissemination. Instead of relying solely on traditional Western news channels like CNN or BBC, African populations leveraged decentralized digital platforms. Telegram channels, WhatsApp groups, and local social media influencers became powerful tools for disseminating alternative narratives. Pan-African YouTubers and independent journalists played a vital role in reframing the story, highlighting the popular support for these new governments and their anti-imperialist stance. They controlled their own story, bypassing traditional gatekeepers and directly engaging with their audiences. By doing so, they effectively took back the microphone, shaping public opinion both within the continent and among the diaspora. This media victory demonstrated a profound understanding of modern information warfare. When you control the story, you control the world's perception of power and ultimately influence geopolitical outcomes. So, how did Africa manage to outsmart the West in such a profound and understated manner? It was not through conventional warfare or aggressive propaganda campaigns. Instead, it was a testament to discipline, timing, and a burgeoning sense of Pan-African unity. One, African nations systematically kicked out old powers. They strategically dismantled the lingering military and political presence of former colonial masters, asserting their territorial and political sovereignty. 2. Formed new alliances. They diversified their partnerships, embracing a multipolar world and engaging with emerging global powers that offered more equitable terms of engagement. 3. Reclaimed resources. They began to assert greater control over their natural resources, challenging exploitative agreements and demanding a larger share of the wealth generated from their own lands. And 4. They shifted public opinion through effective use of new media and a clear articulation of their national interests. They successfully reframed the narrative, both domestically and internationally. They did not seek external validation or beg for aid. They simply declared, with quiet resolve, "We will do it our way," and they did. This strategic autonomy marks a new chapter in global geopolitics, demonstrating that power is not solely defined by military might or economic dominance, but also by strategic foresight and unwavering self-determination. The West didn't lose Africa in a conventional sense. Africa, with deliberate intent and strategic precision, walked away. It chose a path of self-determination, forging new alliances and reclaiming its agency on the global stage. While much of the world remained preoccupied with traditional power centers, a new Africa rose, powerful, strategic, and sovereign. If you are not paying attention to these profound shifts now, you are already behind the curve of global understanding. The implications for international relations, economic development, and the future of the global order are immense. Subscribe to Politics, Power, and Policy, because this isn't just news. It's the future unfolding in real time. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss our deep dives into the geopolitical landscape. Subscribe so I know you like this content, comment, and share to anyone who wants to understand the real-world politics in real time. And until next time, my friends, stay safe and informed.